It's nearing November, meaning that it's once again election season in the United States, and with that comes the inane screaming that has been customary in American political discourse. The polarization in American politics has become so pronounced that people are wondering if American democracy is even worth saving. In fact, the US Democracy Index rating has decreased since 2006 from a full democracy to a flawed democracy. The report's cited reasons for this include eroding public trust in elected officials and governmental institutions, increasing voting restrictions, and absurdly high costs associated with running for office, making it available only to the extremely wealthy. So, is this cause for worry or celebration? In this video, I will argue that the modern Western form of democracy is a fundamentally flawed system, but despite these flaws, I will also explain why I think it must remain in place. First, I want to address those who argue that the only legitimate authority is derived from the people, and that therefore, democracy is the only viable option despite its flaws. Democracy does mean rule of the people. However, the standard of rule of the people is impossibly high, one that even modern democracies cannot reach. Today, when we use the term democracy, we mean a specific type of democracy, namely, a liberal democracy. A liberal democracy differs from, for example, a direct democracy in two important ways. One, it isn't ruled directly from the people, but by representatives appointed by the people. And two, the power of the governing body is limited by constitutional provisions. Because liberalism values individual freedom above all else, liberal democracies have certain guardrails in place to prevent a tyranny of the majority, wherein the majority pursues their own desires to the detriment of the minority, resulting in oppression. As a result, however, the majority decision, the truly democratic decision, is obstructed. Therefore, liberal democracies are not really democratic, because the will of the people is not always followed. It's not rule of the people in the end. It is only the denial of the disparity between the rulers and the ruled. Moreover, there's no guarantee that these representatives will actually represent the people that elect them. Not only is it impossible for a human to perfectly mirror the will of their electors, but more importantly, we cannot choose which representatives run for office. This is crucial, because when people choose to run for office, rather than the office itself or the people choosing them, then their personal motivations underlie that choice, and those personal motivations may not be as noble as we'd like. This isn't to say that all politicians are power-hungry, but those who are will be more driven to run for office. And even if one isn't motivated by the pursuit of power, their hand may still be forced. After all, in a democracy, candidates must compete for people's votes. This means that politicians may have to sacrifice their own ideals and long-term visions to maintain power in the short term, a problem that has been only exacerbated by the media's increasing influence on society. Your qualifications and actual policies no longer matter. Only your ability to sway voters with sound bites proliferated by the media. In the eyes of some political theorists, journalists and commentators have had a crucial role in maintaining democracy over the years. The media can be viewed as a fourth branch of government in the United States, akin to the European fourth estate. The media is commonly perceived as an entity separate from the government, whose duty is to inform the public about major events and hold elected officials accountable for any misconduct. However, this image of a public utility is marred by reality. Large sections of American media are controlled by the world's largest conglomerates. They are private corporations, overwhelmingly owned by the richest strata of society. The fourth estate has thus become an extension of the second estate. One good example of this phenomenon impacting news coverage was just a few years ago. It was revealed that, in 2007, Jeff Bezos, among other billionaires, had evaded all of his federal income tax. The Washington Post quickly responded with an opinion editorial titled, "Think twice before changing the tax rules to soak billionaires," which is entirely unsurprising when one realizes that Bezos owns the Washington Post. In a democracy, especially ones in societies as vast and impersonal as modern Western civilization, whoever controls the flow of information largely controls the public opinion, and the media is owned by powerful corporations and some of the world's richest men. This demonstrates the greatest issue with democracy, particularly in a radically capitalist country. The upper classes are in a great position to concentrate and consolidate power for themselves. While corruption has long been the bane of any political system, our contemporary democracies have renamed corruption as lobbying, making it not only legal, but positive. This gives big business every opportunity to manipulate policy. The first example of this that comes to mind is financing parties and candidates, creating leverage. Politicians must now think twice before opposing the wishes of a corporation, because such action could greatly impact their campaign finances, making running for office potentially financially infeasible. Big business also has leverage over society, and not just through advertising money. The European Round Table of Industrialists, a lobby group composed of representatives from various large corporations, have managed to pressure EU politicians into promoting certain policies by threatening to shut down and move their businesses abroad, which would greatly harm European citizens and their economy. The most prominent of these policies include the European Single Market, the European Monetary Union, and infrastructure projects of the planned Trans-European Networks, designed by ERT themselves. This leads us to the next leverage that big business exercises over legislation and policy: their supposed expertise. Lobbying first emerged as interest groups expressing a willingness to aid politicians in writing laws. Politicians must contend with issues from a variety of industries, and are obviously unable to be experts in all of them, so theoretically, the aid of experts from interest groups should assist in forming better regulation. However, what instead resulted was corporations sending representatives to write legislation that merely served their own interests. This cannot even be considered free market capitalism, but instead a corporate oligarchy capable of strangling competition by means of the market and the government. When it comes to the media, one could argue that the rise of the internet evades corporate control over the flow of information. Since the process is decentralized, it's more democratic, truer to the opinion of the people. The new public square, so to speak. This public square, however, is privately owned. While the outlets and channels people use to convey their opinions function as public utilities, they are private property of big tech companies, meaning that all content on these platforms must abide by their rules. Speech has long been regulated on these platforms so as to not deter or frighten advertisers, but there is also a great danger inherent to the already existing cooperation between big tech and government, where the government could hypothetically use the private status of social media platforms to bypass First Amendment protections. So, the internet is not the solution to traditional media being usurped by big business, because big tech is also big business. The transnational status of these corporations means that they are not internal influences, but rather a distinct international stratum without loyalty to any nation. Interest in the fulfillment of any people outside of themselves doesn't exactly yield tangible profits, after all. It's reminiscent of how aristocrats in the past felt a greater connection and fellowship to foreign nobility than to the peasant populations of their own nation. As J.R.R. Tolkien put it, "The true equation is democracy equals government by world financiers. The main mark of modern governments is that we do not know who governs. We see the politician and not his backer, still less the backer of the backer, or, what is most important of all, the banker of the backer. Enthroned above all, in a manner without parallel in all past, is the veiled prophet of finance, swaying all men living by a sort of magic, and delivering oracles in a language not understood of the people." Many like to claim that humans aren't naturally democratic, but I would like to take it one step further and say that people aren't naturally political either. We cannot criticize democracy by saying that the majority of states throughout history have been undemocratic, when most populations throughout history have not even been politically engaged. Democracy is a form of government in a state, but most human societies have been stateless. They instead lived in small communities and villages, where there is not only rule of the people, but rule by the people. The community directly and personally impacts you, meaning that not only would you be part of the decision-making process, but also part of the implementation of those decisions. States, on the other hand, are vast and impersonal entities, tying together millions of people far beyond the scope of a village or tribe. A democracy forces upon the ordinary person the partial responsibility to dictate the affairs of these enormous systems, far beyond his desire and interest. The ordinary person cannot participate in this system without necessary institutions in place. For example, he cannot make informed decisions, be aware of corrupt candidates, and so on, without a functioning media in place. When these systems become entrenched, it becomes impossible to live away from them, as not only is the life of ordinary men heavily tied to the existence of the state, but the ordinary man becomes, after a time of reliance, docile and dependent upon the state and its institutions. Despite all these problems, the solution is not to be found in dictatorships. First of all, many of the issues of contemporary democracy that we've discussed can be overcome. Conflicting interests and economic motivations will always be an issue to some extent, of course, but it doesn't have to be as prevalent of an issue as it is now. A weakened elite, smaller lower class, and a broader middle class, a country more uniform in its interests, all of this will work much better than what we currently have. As for the other issues, while there are indeed theoretical alternatives which may even be considered logically better, they may be practically impossible. This is because democracy is both the prevailing way of governance, but also the prevailing authority and legitimacy. During other periods in history, the authority of leaders, for example monarchs, was conceived as being derived from God. There was therefore little political conflict arising from the populace, as the authority and legitimacy of the monarch was seen as sacred. Now, on the other hand, the only thing which is sacred is the people's will. Even strictly dictatorial countries throughout the 20th and 21st centuries found their justification in the masses. Be it communism or fascism, it was either the dictatorship of the proletariat or the Il Duce, a figurehead of the nation and people. This illustrates that democracy, despite all its flaws, is a system that cannot be dismantled as affairs currently stand. When the entire concept of a state, as it currently is, exists to serve its citizens, is democracy even optional?